Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode number 9 in our series of podcasts here at Firm Thinking. My name is Kevin Quinn, and I'm here today with my son, Christopher Quinn. Chris is one of the associates in our litigation department. And today, Chris and I are going to talk about clergy abuse cases. Chris and I have handled a number of these cases. I think right now we have something like, about a dozen of them or so that are in litigation. Now, obviously, we're not going to talk about the specifics of our cases, but we do get a lot of questions about clergy abuse cases, not only from clients or potential clients, but also from lawyers who don't regularly handle these types of cases. So today I thought what we would do is kind of give an overview of our approach to these cases and try to address some of the questions that we commonly field. One of the things I want to also ask Chris to do is give us an overview of how courts are interpreting these cases and looking at these cases right now, as well as what's going on in Harrisburg. We see in the press from time to time that there are reports of potentially changing the law in Pennsylvania to provide a further opportunity for adult victims of clergy abuse to pursue claims for harms that are inflicted upon them, in many instances, decades ago. So Chris is going to give us an overview of all of that. Now, one thing I wanted to say at the outset is in the way we have approached these cases, we have not sued the priests that inflicted the harms upon our clients. In many instances, that would actually be impossible to do because the abuse occurred so long ago that the priests are now dead. Instead, what we have done is we have pursued claims against the Diocese of Scranton and against its former and current bishop. And Chris will explain the basis for pursuing these types of claims. Before we get into the substance of the podcast today, though, one of the things I wanted to address is how it was that Chris and I first became involved in these types of cases. As you can imagine, taking on the Diocese of Scranton, taking on its bishops, has not been a popular or an easy path for us to follow. Chris and I are not winning any popularity contests right now with local priests and church officials. And for us, that's been a bitter pill to swallow, because for Chris and I, our faith and our religion have always been very important to us. I was born in an Irish Catholic family. I was raised a devout Catholic. I was educated through the Catholic education system throughout my entire elementary, high school career, college, even law school. I went to Catholic University School of Law. Chris also went to Scranton Prep. He went to Duquesne University School of Law. Both of those are Jesuit institutions. So for Chris and I, our faith and our religion have always been a very important part of our lives. And we have had very positive experiences with the church and also with the priests that we've been interacting with. But Chris and I are among the lucky ones because we haven't been abused like so many others have. And how we got involved in these cases, a couple of years ago, buddies of mine, guys that I've known since high school, guys that I went to high school with, contacted me and told me that they were abused in a sexual manner by a local parish priest. And I got to be honest, that blew me away when I heard that. I had no idea. I'd known these guys for years, and I had no idea that when they were little boys, they were raped and sodomized and abused in disgusting ways by their local parish priest. And for me, that really hit home. I mean, we're the same age. I grew up in the Nativity section of Scranton. These guys, my buddies, grew up not far away in the Manuka section of Scranton. We belonged to different parishes, but when I found out what had happened to them, it really hit home, and I really realized that but for those few city blocks that separated where we grew up and the fact that we belonged to different parishes, what happened to my friends could have happened to me or could have happened to one of my 3 brothers. And that was earth-shattering for me, to be honest with you. And then, of course, and Chris is going to address in a little bit the grand jury report that came out in August of 2018. And that report revealed that really all of this could have and should have been avoided. And that's how it was that we first got involved in these cases. So Chris, to address some of the questions that we have fielded, One of the things that we're asked from time to time is about the statute of limitations and how it applies to clergy abuse cases. So why don't you give us just an overview of, first of all, what the statute of limitations is, and then how it applies in these types of cases.
So the statute of limitations, in general terms, is the amount of time after injury in which you have to file a lawsuit. The law imposes a limitation so that you're not filing a lawsuit too long after the injury. In a normal tort claim, negligence, something like that, it's generally 2 years. And for a long time, the law in Pennsylvania there was an exception for cases of sexual abuse when the victim was under the age of 18. The law was that you had to file suit within 12 years of reaching the age of majority, so that would have been by your 30th birthday, or else you're time barred. Now, I know we're going to talk about the grand jury report, but one of the recommendations in that grand jury report, and it's a recommendation that ultimately came to fruition, was to have the Pennsylvania legislature give more time for that, to allow a longer amount of time after the abuse to file suit. So in, I believe it was 2019, there was legislation that was passed that now you have, if the abuse occurs when you're under the age of 18, you have 37 years after you reach the age of majority, meaning you have until you're 55 if the abuse occurred while you were a minor. And then I believe it's if you're between the ages of 18 and 24, you still have until you reach the age of 30 to file suit. But again, that's something that doesn't apply retroactively. So if somebody is currently time barred, meaning their claim can't be brought, that legislation that was passed doesn't allow them to bring a lawsuit.
All right, and we're going to talk about what's going on in Harrisburg in a little bit, but as you know, some of the victims that have come to us and that we represent right now are over 55. So maybe this would be a good point to discuss the grand jury report. Now, that's a report that's publicly available. It's a very disturbing read, I can be honest with you when I say that. And without getting into gory details, can you just give our viewers just an overview of what was revealed through that grand jury report and how that impacts on this statute of limitations issue?
So the grand jury report, it really is the launch pad for a lot of this legislation, a lot of these lawsuits, but it was publicly released, a redacted version of which in 2018 in August. But it was a grand jury that the Pennsylvania Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, had investigating allegations of child sexual abuse in 6 dioceses across Pennsylvania. So all of the dioceses except for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and the Diocese of Altoona-Johnstown, there were separate grand juries earlier which investigated those dioceses. But what it ultimately was through the Attorney General's subpoena power, the grand jury was able to receive testimony and evidence. I believe there was dozens of witnesses that testified, over 500,000 documents that were reviewed, and it was earth-shattering. What it revealed was that there was credible allegations just from what they saw against more than 300 diocesan priests across Pennsylvania. There was more than 1,000 identifiable victims of that abuse. But really what the important part of the grand jury report, separate and apart from the actual abuse that was uncovered, was the scale of the cover-up, the systematic nature of how the diocese and their officials, including the bishops, would take these actions of suppressing information. I think a lot of people, when you read the grand jury report, which again is publicly available, there's actually reports of abuse, and it's in canon law. Reports of abuse were kept separate and apart from priests' actual personnel files and what they described as secret archives. There was this pattern and practice of receiving reports of abuse, and then instead of reporting those reports to the police, the Child Investigative Services, yeah, who you would imagine that should be hearing about that immediately, the diocese would do their own biased investigations that they would, when it was in trying to avoid scandal, and that when information got out about it, rather than I guess, being candid and saying what happened, they would move that priest to a different diocese where it might not be as well known, and that was really the important part of the grand jury report.
Well, and it was also not just kept from law enforcement authorities or child protective services. That information that the diocese and its bishops had available to them was also kept from parishioners. And so when parents were asked if their son Johnny could go with their local priest, these parents had no idea of the rampant sexual abuse and exploitation of minors that was going on in the Catholic Church at that time. And that is another disturbing revelation through that grand jury report. So, earlier I was talking about our approach to these cases and how instead of naming the priest that inflicted the harms on the children, we are pursuing claims against the diocese and its current and one of the former bishops. Can you maybe just give us an overview of how what was revealed through that grand jury report has been construed by courts in allowing these types of claims to be pursued?
Yeah, so the grand jury report, after the grand jury report came out, I had mentioned earlier there was the 37th investigating grand jury was focusing specifically on the Diocese of Altoona-Johnstown. There was a woman who had been sexually abused by a priest when she was a minor. It was decades earlier. And when that grand jury report came out and she saw the scale of the cover-up, she filed a lawsuit against the diocese and its bishops. And historically, those cases were thrown out as time-barred. But the Superior Court in 2019 decided an opinion. It was Rice versus Diocese of Altoona-Johnstown. The claims were conspiracy, fraud, and constructive fraud. And it wasn't against the offending priest for the sexual abuse, but it was against the diocese for their own intentional acts that put her in harm's way originally and then risked greater harms later in life when she read this grand jury report and saw for the first time that what happened to her wasn't just the result of one bad egg. It was the people that enabled her. And so that's kind of what it was. And what the court decided in Rice, there was 3 central holdings, but the main takeaway is that when you invoke that statute of limitations defense, there's a discovery rule, which means that can be told in instances where the cause of your injury isn't known or reasonably knowable. And so what the court said there is, based off of the grand jury report, it's up to a jury to decide whether or not a reasonable person in this plaintiff's shoes could have or should have known what the diocese was doing, what the bishops were allegedly doing in terms of this cover-up. And so what Rice decided was that this is for a jury to decide. They're not going to throw her out of court.
Right. And, for many of our clients, they described their reaction when the grand jury report came out. And I remember one of the clients saying that, up until that grand jury report was published, he thought that he had been victimized by just the priests that abused him. But the grand jury report, brought light for him to the fact that he was victimized by the entire institution and by the bishops that were empowered with knowledge or empowered with the ability to prevent this from happening and took no action. Obviously that's a very upsetting piece of information for somebody who's trying to bury these demons to realize that it all could have and should have been avoided. So what's the current status right now, Chris, of that Rice case?
So Rice, and it was predictable, after the Superior Court, it's a permissive appeal to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court decides what they want to hear. And in this instance, because of the scale of the opinion and the public nature of it, the Supreme Court did accept an appeal. There was oral argument, I believe, on October 20th of 2020, and it just hangs in the balance until then. It's hard to say how long it's going to take the Supreme Court to issue their ruling and their opinion, but it could be months, it could be a year. It's difficult to say, but it's something that they have heard argument on.
Well, and until and unless the Supreme Court reverses the decision of the Superior Court, that Superior Court decision remains the law in Pennsylvania, is that right?
Correct. Yeah, just the accepting of an appeal doesn't change the precedential value. So
right.
It's the law of Pennsylvania.
All right. Well, and speaking of the law of Pennsylvania, again, we have seen a lot of coverage in the press from time to time about our lawmakers down in Harrisburg possibly changing the law to provide a further window of opportunity for adult victims of this type of abuse to pursue claims. And can you just give our viewers an update on where things stand in Harrisburg?
Yeah, so I had mentioned that that increase of the statute of limitations, which the grand jury recommended, that happened. The one thing that the grand jury recommended that hasn't yet come to fruition was the establishment of a 2-year window that they've been calling it for these cases of child sexual abuse, which again applies to the diocese, but it would have broader scope than that. It would allow a 2-year window to revive those claims for those individuals to now file suit. And what needed to happen is they said that it would require a constitutional amendment under Pennsylvania law. That means that such a law would need to pass in consecutive terms in the General Assembly.
And that's debatable, right?
Yeah, I personally don't agree with that. I think that it could just be done by the passing of a statute, but they said that it required constitutional amendment after it was blocked the first time. It requires it to pass in the General Assembly in consecutive terms, and then it goes to the voters of Pennsylvania. It would be on the ballot in May. And you might have seen in the news, what happened was it passed in the first term, it passed in the House in the second term in January. It was slated to pass in the Senate just after that, but one of the procedural requirements that is a condition precedent to getting it on the ballot in May is it needs to be advertised by the Pennsylvania Department of State, the Secretary of State's office, and they just dropped the ball here. It wasn't advertised. It was just a complete blunder, and so now it's uncertain what's going to happen. I know that they're exploring the option of some kind of emergency provisions that would allow it to be before the Pennsylvania voters in May. But if that doesn't happen, there's a chance that the process starts again, and that it would be another 2 years before that's something that is able to come to fruition.
So the long and the short of it is we don't know if the law is going to change, and if so, when it's going to change, right?
Correct. We'll have a better idea in April. I think those emergency efforts, it would need to be completed by April to be on the May ballot, but we won't know until then.
Okay. All right. The last point, and I want to wrap it up, last point we wanted just to address is the Independent Survivors Compensation Program. That, again, is something that's been widely covered in the press. And for anybody that has any questions about that program, let me just give you a quick overview. This compensation program was set up by the Diocese of Scranton in January of 2019. So that was about 4 or 5 months after the grand jury report came out, and things really started hitting the fan for the diocese. They were getting a lot of bad publicity. And so the diocese set up this program that was intended to afford victims of clergy abuse the opportunity to apply for compensation. Unfortunately, that program has now closed. So if if there are any victims out there who would have otherwise pursued the opportunity to seek compensation through this program, unfortunately, you're not able to do that right now. I think at this point, we've addressed the majority. Is there any questions that you remember we've been fielding that we haven't addressed today?
I think that's most of it.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, we want to thank you very, very much for joining us. We want everybody to stay safe, and so long.